Hello everyone and welcome back to Paul's Hardware. Today is the long anticipated launch of Intel's Arc A580 graphics card. The middle child in the Arc lineup that was announced more than a year ago has finally come to market. The big question about it was the price, since it's not that far cut down from the Arc A750, and that price is $180 US. It's slightly more than I was hoping for. I was thinking maybe $150 to $170, but we're gonna see today if that price is worth it, because I'm gonna be testing the Arc A580, specifically the ASRock Challenger OC model right here, against its nearest competition from AMD Radeon, that's the RX 7600, as well as NVIDIA's RTX 3050.
Excellent!
Today's video is brought to you by Micro Center. This is one of my favorite places to buy PC parts. So if you're building or upgrading your PC, I highly recommend making your way down to one of their 25 retail stores in the US. They have consistently competitive prices and an excellent selection of PC hardware and other tech goodies. And they have a custom PC builder on the Micro Center website. Use it to spec out your rig and it will show you parts in store at your nearest location while ensuring compatibility. Then you can pick up in store or have their pros assemble it for you. So click the sponsor link in the description to find a Micro Center near you. So let me start by explaining why I was a bit intrigued when Intel told me they were actually going to launch the Arc A580. I like budget builds because I like introducing newcomers to PC gaming, and more recently the middle of the road build that I've been pitching to people is well over $1,000, around $1,200 for my recent builds, and that is a very solid build, but not everyone has that amount of money. The build that I'm pitching today, along with the Arc A580, is much less than that. It's actually less than $700. And in fact, I threw together a quick parts list over on PC Part Picker with the CPU that I'm testing with today, which is the 5600X, as well as a B550 motherboard and 32 gigs of DDR4 3600 RAM, and the total, as of right now, is actually about $662. Granted, there are some upgrades you can make here, like going with a 2TB NVMe SSD, possibly upgrading your case to one that has more fans, or going with a higher wattage power supply if you intend to upgrade your graphics card in the future. But for a lot of people who are just trying to get their toe in the door with an entry-level build, this is right up their alley. And even though it's last generation AM4 platform for AMD with a B550 chipset motherboard, there is still an upgrade path here because the 5800X 3D, which is still one of the top CPUs for gaming, can also upgrade right into that build too. So I had that build in mind when I set up my testing today. We're gonna be testing 5 games, doing side-by-side comparisons with the $180 Arc A580, the $220 NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3050, and $220 is about the cheapest you can find one of these right now, as well as the AMD Radeon RX 7600, which currently goes for about $240 for the cheapest one. But that does mean that for $60 less, the Arc A580 is 25% less expensive than the 7600. And all of these cards have an 8 gig VRAM buffer. Let's take a look at their specifications really quick while I rattle off a few more notes about my testing procedures. We're gonna be testing at 1920 by 1080 as well as 2560 by 1440, even though these cards are more recommended for 1080 than 1440. I also tested with extra features like Intel's XeSS, AMD's FSR, and NVIDIA's DLSS turned off so we could compare the raw performance between these graphics cards versus what you could expect with those features turned on. Because there's a lot of them, it introduces a lot of variables to testing, but please keep in mind that with these cards and all the titles I tested today, you can get higher frame rates than what I'm showing you on screen, either by lowering the game settings from what I'm running or by turning on features like XeSS, DLSS, and FSR, which can get you higher frame rates by using techniques like upscaling. Also, please note that I'm using my X570 test bed here, which does have some higher end components like an EVGA X570 dark motherboard, a 1600 watt Corsair AX1600i power supply, and some nice high-end SSDs. However, the components that will impact gaming performance, which are the CPU, are still the same as in that sub $700 build, which is the 5600X for the CPU, and 32 gigs of DDR4 3600 speed memory. All that said, let's get into the testing. Starting off with Cyberpunk 2077, and we're using the latest patch that came out along with Phantom Liberty. We're running high settings with DLSS, FSR, and XeSS turned off. Cyberpunk doesn't always accept those settings. I had to do a couple reruns and had to reset the game in order to get the settings to stick. But at 1920 by 1080, the Arc A580 was outputting about 65 to 80 frames per second, averaging around 74. We can see that the RTX 3050 is not keeping up. It's down in the 50 to 70 FPS range. 58 FPS on average, and the RX 7600 is maintaining a decent lead, going up to about 80 to 110 frames per second, or 92 FPS on average. If we change resolutions to 2560 by 1440, the frame rates are going to drop. The A580 is now in the 45 to 60 FPS range, about 51 FPS on average. Meanwhile, the RTX 3050 is really struggling, down there in the 30 to 40 FPS range, 37 frames per second average, but the RX 7600 is still holding up pretty well, getting 70 to 90 FPS, or 82 frames per second on average. So that's a pretty decent win for Team Red right there. Our next title is Far Cry 6. We're running high settings with FSR turned off. At 1920 by 1080, the Arc A580 is at 90 to 105 frames per second, averaging about 99 FPS. The RTX 3050 is about 10% slower, running 80 to 95 FPS for 87 frames per second average, and the RX 7600 is once again maintaining the lead at 115 to 145 FPS. It did bounce around a little bit more, but maintained a 126 FPS average. Jumping to 2560 by 1440, the A580 is at about 65 to 85 frames per second, 78 FPS average. The RTX 3050 is staying above 60 FPS, about 60 to 70 frames per second, average of 63, and the RX 7600 is up above 100 to 115 FPS, 106 frames per second average. Next we have Dirt 5 running at high settings, dynamic resolution is off, FSR is off. At 1920 by 1080, the Arc A580 is at about 95 to 110 frames per second, averaging 103. The RTX 3050 is 70 to 85 FPS, so still a decent step behind the A580, averaging 78, but the 7600 is still a decent step ahead, getting up to 120 to 145 FPS, or 140 on average. If we bump the resolution up to 1440, the A580 is now at 70 to 90 FPS, 86 average. The RTX 3050 is having a hard time sticking to 60 FPS. It's between 50 and 65, but it did get 60 on average. And the RX 7600 is once again maintaining a pretty good lead at 95 to 120 FPS, or 108 on average. Here's Doom Eternal for some Vulkan testing. Note that this is not a built-in benchmark, so the test runs here are going to vary a little bit more from run to run. We are running the Ultra preset though, which is one step below Nightmare with DLSS turned off. The A580 at 1920 by 1080 was hitting 165 to 220 frames per second, averaging about 185. Meanwhile, the RTX 3050 was down in the 140 to 195 FPS range, 165 on average, about 20 below the Arc A580. And again, the RX 7600 is maintaining about a 50 frames per second lead, fluctuating between 185 and 260 for about 230 FPS on average. Again, if we increase the resolution to 2560 by 1440, the frame rates will drop, but we're still hitting 120 to 155 FPS with the A580, about 135 on average. The RTX 3050 is about 15 frames behind in the 95 to 145 frames per second range, or 120 on average, and the RX 7600 maintaining a lead still, 135 to 170 FPS, or 155 on average. And our last game is Starfield, a game I'm happy to test because it's a new and popular title. However, it did present a few complications that I will explain as we go through this. I'm testing using the medium preset with dynamic resolution and FSR turned off, and Starfield actually had an update yesterday on October 9th to version 1.7.36. So I did go back and rerun my tests with the update because one of the patch notes is improved stability for Intel Arc GPUs. So here's my test run at 1920 by 1080, and by the way, I'm using CapFrame X and Riva Tuner to show this overlay of the stats on screen that you're looking at. The Arc A580 got about 26 to 34 frames per second, averaging around 30, so that was a decent step behind the RTX 3050, which was getting around 35 to 45 frames per second, averaging around 40, and then the RX 7600, which was outputting some pretty nice performance for this game, 60 to 75 FPS, or about 69 frames per second on average. However, there was a weird quirk with the game that I noticed because I was going back and rerunning tests. If I open the game menu, after I load my save up, it actually tanks the frame rate, dropping from say maybe 30 average at 1080 down to maybe 22-ish. It was pretty noticeable, and it did that at both resolutions, so I contacted Intel to let them know about the behavior, and I ran these tests with like a fresh load so I wasn't getting that frame drop. And then there was one last wrench in my testing, which was that Intel dropped a driver update at the very last minute, about 14 hours before the embargo listed, and the driver update had specific improvements for Starfield, like up to 117% uplift at 1080p Ultra, up to 149% uplift at 1440 High. So switching from the driver I used originally, 4830, to the new driver, 4887, resulted in this at 1080p, about 39 to 44 frames per second, averaging about 42. However, again, at the end of my run, after I let it go for a while so I could compare to the other cards again, I popped up the menu again and I did see that frame drop still happen. So it doesn't seem like it's been addressed with this particular driver, but I have let Intel know about it. Dropped me down to about 29 FPS, which is better than before, but still a decent drop from the 42 average. So let's switch over to 2560 by 1440. So here with the older driver, 4830, I was getting 24 to 29 FPS, averaging about 27. That's compared to the RTX 3050, which was a step faster, about 27 to 37 frames per second for Team Green here, with about 32 average FPS. And then the RX 7600 performing quite nicely once again, 50 to 65 FPS, 56 on average. I did test that menu switch again, and my frame rate dropped from about 27 average down to 16, so that's still happening here. But then here's the run with the driver updated version 4887. That upped my FPS from about 27 average to about 34 average, so I was getting between 30 and 38 FPS. And I don't know if that math works out to what Intel's claiming in terms of an uplift here, but it is a decent uplift, so I was glad I reran this test with the updated driver. And here was also perhaps a ray of hope, is that when I opened up the menu at the end of the run, my frame rate dropped to about 19 to 22 FPS, but then it kind of bounced back and recovered. Whereas before I would have to actually exit the game completely, reload and load up my save again in order to recover my frame rate back to what it was supposed to be. So there's my side-by-side testing. I did set this video up a little bit differently than my typical benchmark review videos, but I am sort of getting back into the swing of things after taking roughly 4 or 5 months off from doing this type of content. That said, I do have one more metric to share, and that is the peak power draw for the entire system across all the tests between the cards. Here is probably the only area where the RTX 3050 shines. It's pretty good in terms of efficiency, only peaking at 261.3 watts. Meanwhile, the RX 7600 got up to just shy of 300 watts, 298.9. Meanwhile, the Arc A580 was a bit more power hungry, peaking at 327.9 watts. So clearly, if efficiency is your thing at the expense of all else, the RTX 3050 is a decent choice. But I would say in comparison to the performance that you get, and especially down in this budget range where the difference of 30 to 60 watts in terms of power draw isn't going to make as much of a difference, especially compared to the $40 to $60 price difference. But I still wanted to point out the relative lack of efficiency for the A580 by comparison. So now that we've taken a look at the numbers, and I know this is not my typical full review, but that does give us a good idea of where these cards stand. What is the upshot? First off, the RTX 3050 just looks really silly. There's a rumor that NVIDIA might be releasing an even lower powered version of the RTX 3050, and I really hope they don't. I'm actually sad that this card still sells because it's just dumb. It's a dumb graphics card. I don't like it. I think it's maintained a much higher price than it really deserves. And it's not like NVIDIA can't make faster graphics cards than this. They totally can, and they totally do. It's just they price those much higher. If NVIDIA wanted to compete down in the sub $200 price range, they easily could at any time. They could come out with an RTX 4050, or they could lower the price of the RTX 4060, something unprecedented like that. But many of us are holding out hope that Intel's advances in the GPU industry are going to encourage NVIDIA, and maybe even AMD too, to lower their prices and get a little bit more competitive, especially for entry-level gamers. The comparison with the RX 7600 is not quite as favorable because the RX 7600 does outperform the A580. However, it does so at a $60 price premium right now, which down in this budget range is a significant dollar amount. Again, 25% less for the A580 than the 7600. Overall, at least when it comes to my admittedly limited testing, the Arc A580 is definitely a reasonable card for the price they're asking for it. I would say it would be even more compelling if the price could drop by 10 or 20 or even $30. At 150 bucks, the A580 would pretty much smash anything in the sub $200 category, but even at 180 bucks, it is still a viable option for people who are truly trying to stick to a budget. But if you're not in that category, it might be worth your while to scrape together a few more funds to upgrade to something like the A750 or the RX 7600. So there it is, the Intel Arc A580. If you're interested in my $660 to $670 build around this card, check the video description down below. Note that there's not just the ASRock Challenger, but there's a couple other models coming out from Sparkle and I believe Gunnier. And if you didn't check them out already, I'm gonna post links to some other reviews of the Arc A580 that have come out today, because I know there's gonna be some other good ones that test against other cards, or that even have like graphs and stuff like that, because graphs are fun to look at sometimes too. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, hit the thumbs up button. Check out my store at paulshardware.net if you'd like to buy some merchandise, shirts, mugs, pint glasses, and more. Subscribe to my channel if you're not already for more coverage of video cards and PC hardware, and we'll see you all in the next video.